I'm tired of fighting. Our chiefs are slain, the elders have passed. Some of our people have fled to the hills with nothing, no blankets, no food. I must search for my children, hoping to find them among the dead. Sitting Bull, a Lakota warrior, mocks the Crow tribe after raiding their horses. The Crow chief charges, rifle raised, but Sitting Bull is quick to recover from the shot to his foot, retaliating with deadly precision. The Crow chief falls and his warriors flee. With blood dripping from his wound, Sitting Bull rides back through familiar lands, rolling hills, rivers, and the eerie howl of wolves in the distance. The ghostly path of the buffalo and the sleeping teepees reflect the endurance of his people, standing firm on their sacred soil. The victor returns, now known as a medicine man, more attuned to prophecy than battle. On the Great Plains, stealing horses is a practical strategy, crucial to survival. While tribes in the east had already been devastated by European diseases and forced onto reservations, the plains still pulse with life, a mosaic of independent tribes, each with their own complex alliances and rivalries. The European horse revolutionized warfare and hunting, pushing many tribes away from agriculture in favor of a nomadic lifestyle built around hunting bison. The pelt trade with white settlers fueled a rush for wealth, guns, and horses, but overhunting led to a depletion of animal populations. As tribes battled for resources, intertribal conflicts grew, with stronger tribes using their horses and weapons to overpower weaker ones. This shift toward wealth accumulation deepened divisions within the tribes. The role of women, once centered on making bison robes, has evolved into a more demanding economic function. Wealthy men now pay large dowries to marry multiple wives, who labor to increase their husband's wealth. Despite this, the tribes continue to live in tight-knit communities, guided by principles of bravery, generosity, and wisdom. Around the fire, the elders share ancient stories, speaking of sacred beings that dwell in the sky, rocks, and trees. As the westward expansion begins, stagecoaches and covered wagons roll across the plains, carrying displaced white settlers seeking gold. Their journey disrupts the bison migration, and their violent clashes with native peoples force the U.S. military to negotiate safe passage for them. Leaders like Sitting Bull have little trust in the U.S. government. After the Sand Creek Massacre of 1864, where American soldiers slaughtered Cheyenne and Arapaho civilians, mothers and children, tearing scalps and mutilating bodies, Sitting Bull and his followers refused to accept treaties or believe that the American government can be trusted to govern the plains fairly. Earlier, some Lakota chiefs agreed to a treaty allowing an American trail through their land, in exchange for $50,000 in provisions annually for 50 years. However, the U.S. later reduced the agreement to just 10 years. These treaties always left tribes at a disadvantage, especially when it came to their rights to land. Lakota Chief Black Hawk openly acknowledged this. These lands once belonged to the Kiowas and Crows, but we drove them out. This is the same way the white men take what they want from the Indians. The displacement of tribes benefits the U.S. government, as landless and starving tribes like the Pawnee are more likely to accept relocation to reservations. In their fight for survival, the Crow reluctantly allow American trails through their land, though it is traditionally the territory of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota. As Civil War veterans and settlers begin to pour into the region, a Lakota chief named Red Cloud rallies his people, declaring the presence of these outsiders an affront to the spirits of their ancestors. "Shall we allow our sacred graves to be plowed for corn?" Red Cloud declares, "I stand for war." Red Cloud's war unites various tribes in raids on U.S. forts and caravans. The young Lakota warrior Crazy Horse, both distant and driven, lures American soldiers into tall grass where hundreds of allied Indians ambush them. In the aftermath, 81 American soldiers are found naked and mutilated. Red Cloud's decisive victory forces the U.S. to recognize Lakota sovereignty, culminating in the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which grants them a vast swath of reservation land, as well as hunting territories free from white settlement. Later that year, the bold and unpredictable Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer, leading his 7th Cavalry, silently positions his troops under the cover of moonlight near a Cheyenne village. The Cheyenne, resisting removal to Indian Territory in Oklahoma, had retaliated with raids against settlers. Custer, seasoned from his Confederate campaigns, strikes at dawn, storming the village. They kill men, women, and children, burn the teepees, and slaughter nearly 1,000 horses. As the slaughter continues, Red Cloud and his Lakota followers, facing starvation and violence, seek refuge on reservations. Yet even in this forced exile, Red Cloud senses betrayal. During a diplomatic visit to Washington, D.C., Red Cloud uncovers a hidden clause in the 1868 treaty that further undermines the rights of his people. The unceded land will remain native territory only as long as the bison population justifies the hunt. With thousands of Lakota rallying behind Sitting Bull as their supreme war chief, he rejects both the U.S. treaties and the idea of living on a reservation. In the summer of 1873, scouts bring alarming news to his camp. Hundreds of wagons, accompanied by surveyors from the railroad industry, have crossed into Dakota and Montana. Protected by 1,500 U.S. cavalry, led by Colonel David Stanley and his subordinate, George Custer, they push forward. In response, Sitting Bull calls on Crazy Horse and other warriors to launch relentless raids on Custer's expedition. Though the Americans manage to repel them, their victory is short-lived. The railroad laborers they expected never arrive. Global economies collapse, the New York Stock Exchange closes, and titans of industry face bankruptcy. Meanwhile, the Lakota grow stronger, their power surging in the wake of a collapsing world. The Lakota, wealthy in horses and weapons, strike out in all directions, east, north, and west, raiding neighboring tribes, settlers, and even unfortunate white hunters. With their strength and unity, they stand as the most formidable barrier to U.S. expansion. In the summer of 1873, Lakota chiefs Pawnee Killer and Little Wound encounter the Pawnee on disputed hunting grounds. Their warriors launch a brutal massacre, killing nearly 200 Pawnee, most of them women and children, leaving their bodies burned, scattered, and stripped of scalps. The rapid decline of bison herds fuels this violent intertribal conflict and begins to erode Lakota power. As the U.S. economy falters, settlers encroach on indigenous land, hunting bison to extinction. Certain government officials view this as an opportunity to destroy the Plains Indians' vital food source and clear the land for the growing railroad industry. Army officers supply ammunition and protection to the hunters, who, between 1872 and 1874, slaughter millions of bison, 3,000 per day. As the bison disappear, starving Native Americans rely on U.S. rations, only to receive spoiled flour and rancid pork from the corrupt Grant administration. Red Cloud, seeking justice, travels to Washington, D.C., where the Commissioner of Indian Affairs informs him that the U.S. government plans to seize the unceded lands, citing the collapse of bison populations as justification. Meanwhile, Custer secretly ventures into the Black Hills and discovers traces of gold. When the Lakota refuse to sell these sacred lands, President Grant orders his troops to stand aside, allowing white settlers to enter the Black Hills with no resistance. By December 1875, only months after the once dominant Comanche tribe is forced onto a reservation, Grant sets a harsh deadline for the Lakota. By January 31, 1876, every Lakota Sioux must be on the reservation, or they will be considered hostiles, subject to pursuit and death like wild buffalo. As the cold, snow-drenched hills stretch out, the hostiles ride out, defying the government's orders. Sitting Bull's delegates seek alliances with the Arikara, Mandan, and Hidatsa tribes, also venturing north to trade for weapons. As the white invasion presses forward, old tribal rivalries begin to fade, replaced by a common cause. Sitting Bull leads his people westward, toward the bison herds, defying the encroaching settlers. Lakota from reservations, Dakota refugees from Canada, and Cheyenne exiles join him, uniting under a single banner. Their vast encampment stretches for miles across the plains, 10,000 people strong, a powerful multi-ethnic coalition. At an intertribal Sundance ceremony, Sitting Bull, in a deep trance, dances for hours, sharing a vision of enemy soldiers filling the sky like locusts, falling to their deaths. Days later, scouts spot a massive American army not far off. Under the cover of darkness, Crazy Horse prepares his 750 warriors for battle. In a fierce 6-hour clash, they inflict heavy damage, halting the U.S. Army's advance toward the village. Yet, just a week later, Sioux scouts report that more American forces are closing in, now camped along the Bighorn River. The threat is imminent. Women hurriedly pack their belongings, babies crying in their arms. Sitting Bull, always the diplomat, pushes for negotiation, but U.S. soldiers begin firing into teepees and shooting his horse. The Americans aim to destroy the village. In response, Sitting Bull orders a fierce counterattack, sending Cheyenne and Lakota warriors after the retreating soldiers. But just as hope rises, George Custer leads a fresh detachment, charging through ravines and gulches, ready to crush the resistance. The massive Indian encampment is twice the size Custer anticipated. Skilled horse warriors swarm his positions, scattering the retreating Americans on the far side of the river. Custer and about 50 men take refuge on a hill, pulling into a desperate formation. Through the thick clouds of gunsmoke, the vision of their doom emerges, hundreds of fierce warriors charging, led by Crazy Horse. The Cheyenne and Lakota unleash a barrage of arrows and bullets, followed by a brutal onslaught with tomahawks and knives. As blue-clad soldiers writhe in the grass, one young Lakota recalls, "There was a soldier still twitching on the ground. A warrior told me, 'Boy, get off and scalp him.' The soldier's hair is short and the knife is dull, but the Lakota strikes swiftly. I shot him in the forehead and took his scalp. No soldier is left alive. Custer is found torn apart, his body desecrated in the aftermath of the battle. The battle is etched in the memory of a Lakota warrior. They came to fight us, and we had no choice but to fight back. These white men wanted it. They called for it, and I let them have it." After the chaos of battle, the Cheyenne and Lakota clear the remaining field and retreat with their people. Yet, in the halls of Congress, vengeance brews. American lawmakers pass a law forcing the Lakota to relinquish lands outside the Great Sioux Reservation and sell the sacred Black Hills. Despite the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, which stipulated that no land could be ceded without the agreement of 75% of adult male Lakota, Congress approves the deal with only 10%. 7 million acres are seized, and the remaining indigenous people are branded outlaws in the very lands their ancestors once roamed. They search the hills only to find decaying bison carcasses, rotting and infested with maggots. Black smoke clouds the skyline of the Black Hills as men dig into the dark earth, searching for gold. Crazy Horse, after years of resistance, finally surrenders and reports to a reservation. A few months later, he is arrested. During the struggle, a soldier kills him with a bayonet. Meanwhile, Sitting Bull has disappeared. He and his followers have fled to Canada, where they find new herds of bison to hunt, setting up their campfires and pitching teepees, telling the weary legends of their people. The last remnants of indigenous power in North America are fading. Chief Joseph, with 700 of his ailing Nez Perce people, attempts to escape northward to join Sitting Bull, but the U.S. Army relentlessly pursues them, forcing their surrender. A few years later, the bison of Canada begin to dwindle, and in 1881, Sitting Bull leads his people south. The old chief, still limping from the duel long past, surrenders with the solemn words, "I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle." Sitting Bull and his followers are herded onto a steamboat and imprisoned for 2 years in a military fort. Eventually, they are released to the Standing Rock Reservation. Over the following years, starvation, massacres, and broken treaties forced nearly all Native Americans onto reservations. On the Great Plains, once proud warriors are now forced to plow and farm barren land. To save money, the U.S. government cuts rations for the indigenous people, leading to widespread malnutrition and disease among children. In 1889, hope emerges from the southwest. Wovoka, a prophet from the Paiute tribe, foretells that the spirits of fallen ancestors will return to drive the white settlers away. He predicts the return of Jesus and a new land, abundant with buffalo and free from war. Wovoka claims that this vision can be realized through the regular performance of the ghost dance ritual. Across the western U.S., weakened tribes begin to dance, hoping for deliverance and divine intervention. Fearing the growing movement, U.S. officials become paranoid, suspecting Sitting Bull's support for the ritual, and order his arrest. For generations, Plains Indians preserved their history through winter counts, oral records of significant events. In 1890, one such entry captures the tragic scene. Dozens of reservation police surround Sitting Bull's cabin. A supporter of Sitting Bull attacks Indian agent Bullhead, who spins and shoots Sitting Bull in the chest. Another officer fires a fatal shot to his head. Crowfoot, Sitting Bull's 14-year-old son, hides under a bed but is dragged out and killed. Many of Sitting Bull's followers flee to the camp of Lakota Chief Spotted Elk. U.S. troops from Custer's 7th Cavalry pursue them to Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. There, the soldiers begin confiscating weapons. A struggle with a villager escalates into violence, and the troops open fire with cannons, slaughtering the Lakota warriors. They then turn their guns on the fleeing women, children, and elderly. The scene is harrowing. A baby nurses from its dead mother's body. Survivors are promised safety if they come forward, but as young boys emerge from hiding, soldiers surround and kill them without mercy. A fierce winter storm descends, freezing the twisted bodies in its final grip. Brown blood clings to tiny fingers, now locked in the cold. The lifeless body of Chief Spotted Elk stands grotesquely upright, a haunting image of death. In the aftermath of the Wounded Knee Massacre, men arrived to hastily bury nearly 300 dead, piling their bodies into mass graves. The U.S. government passes more laws to fracture reservations, enabling white settlers to claim land that was once guaranteed to the Plains Indians by treaty. On reservations, food rations are reduced to force families to sell off valuable land. Traditional indigenous practices are banned, and children are taken to residential schools, where their languages are forbidden, and they are forced to adopt English and Christianity. As one headmaster puts it, the mission of the residential schools is clear: kill the Indian in him and save the man. The Great Plains no longer echo with the sounds of the past. The roar of industry has replaced the thunderous stampede of 60 million bison. By the late 19th century, fewer than 1,000 bison remain. A new age begins, one of abundance built on squalor, progress tempered by exhaustion. Factory-made automobiles sputter down city streets, while oil rigs puncture the once pristine western landscape, and telephone wires slice through the sky. Towns, rivers, and mountains now bear names that erase the people who once called them home, eerie memorials to those who were killed or exiled. The people of the plains, though scattered, are not extinct. Despite the hardships, the people will fight to preserve their cultures and languages. Yet in 1909, through eyes dimmed by age and sorrow, an old warrior reflects from a reservation. Red Cloud's weathered face tells the story of 9 decades of battle and loss. In a quiet moment, he recalls the vast plains of his youth, pondering the new fight before him. I once owned fertile land, so vast I couldn't ride across it in a week on my fastest pony. Now I am confined here, forced to beg Washington for food. I must beg for what I once owned,